Welcome, everybody, to another Perceptive podcast here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am, of course, Josh Blazer, and we got a great cast for you this evening. We have two guests on tonight we're going to be discussing about the concepts of using time as a game mechanic, as well as just its use in design, including a talk about speedrunning. So please welcome back to the podcast frequent guest, John Brieger.
Hi, everybody.
And he brought a friend along, a speedrunner as well as a designer, Vincent. How are you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me. Doing good.
It's great to have you guys both on. We had a little bit of some Discord-related shenanigans. We got them straightened out. Always the fun of messing around with things, right?
It wouldn't be a
that's the
stream.
challenge, I think, of being a board game designer. You know, I have to hop on Discord and everything breaks.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be streaming if there weren't audio difficulties.
Of course not. For my fans watching, of course, they know we've had plenty of audio and internet-related issues when these things go live. It's all good before and then just goes to heck the second we turn things on.
I think that I once streamed for 30 full minutes and was completely muted the entire time.
Oh, I've done that too. And now my fans, they try to troll me by also saying, Josh, we can't hear you, when I'm perfectly fine.
You're just screaming louder into the microphone like someone who doesn't quite know how a telephone works.
Mm-hmm.
I just love the culture of live streaming when you say, "Can you hear me now?" and then everybody in the chat just goes, "No, we can't hear you."
Yeah, that's great. But it's great to have you guys on. As always, John, it's a pleasure to have you back on, and it's great to meet you for the first time, Vincent.
Thank you, Josh. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's helpful for us to talk a little bit about who we are and why we, a little bit why we're on the show. I don't know, Vincent, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I have been working with John on co-designing a couple games that he's been working on over the last, what has it been now? 3 years?
Yeah, or decades, depending on how you count.
Well, that's true. Known John for long time, since middle school. So we've been playing games for a long time, designing games for a little bit of time. And then when I'm not doing that, I'm speedrunning on Twitch for the most part. And I speedrun one of the games in the Legend of Zelda series, Majora's Mask. So.
And of course, for the fans watching, Majora's Mask is a really good example of having time as part of the equation when it comes to a gameplay loop.
Absolutely. We actually, just in the speedrunning Discord the other day, someone was talking about, what if we modded the game to have 7 days? And I was like, well, considering you're doubling the amount of time, that really has a pretty big impact on the design. I think it would be quite an undertaking to develop the amount of content you'd need to fill those extra days.
For my designer friends in chat right now are watching this recording, I'm sure they can get that done very quickly, right, guys? You can add double the content in a Legend of Zelda game.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm sure it'll just be super, super easy.
Of course. And as I just said, John, you've been on the cast several times. But for any new people watching, what is your background kind of role with things?
Yeah, so I'm John Brieger. I am a board game developer and board game designer. Those roles are a little different in board games than they are in video games. So as a designer, I work on my own games and license them out to publishers. And as a developer, I help clean up games that are coming in from other designers. So I run a lot of playtesting programs and a lot of kind of user research and player research. And that's my background. But even before I went into games was running design and design research programs in the Apple retail stores.
Yeah.
So try to kind of bring in some things from outside of the gaming industry and apply some of the things that designers have learned about making great experiences for people into games.
Yeah. And for my fans or people watching the cast right now, our first cast with John, it was all about playtesting and kind of getting the UI and user experience down and how that can be applied to both tabletop and video games as well.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's been really fun about working with Vincent too. Is obviously Vincent's a speedrunner, and so we haven't never done anything digital together, but I think there's been a lot of kind of crossover of experience of especially our new project together. Chrono Corsairs is a game about time loops, and obviously there's not that many board games about there, so we were pulling a lot more from pop culture in terms of video games, movies, TV, to try to draw our inspiration for how time was going to work.
Yeah. And like we said at the start, there's a lot of different avenues when it comes to time that we can certainly draw from or discuss for tonight. And I figured let's start with speedrunning, then we'll talk about time as a mechanic. We can definitely bring back Majora's Mask for that. And then for like our third and final topic, we'll see if we get there, we'll talk more about your game and how everything kind of links together.
Sure thing.
So, speedrunning has definitely been one of the more interesting things that kind of grow out of the video game culture, especially over this past decade. I think, like, for myself, I think, like most people watching, the first time I got acquainted with that was, of course, with, I think it was a GDQ event. I think this was like 2, maybe 3 years ago. And then that kind of got me, I fell down the rabbit hole of Mario Maker speedruns and then Kaizo games. And it's only been a very fascinating way. I think it's a very interesting way of like, kind of illuminating some of these titles. And I guess for you, Vincent, besides speedrunning Majora's Mask, were there any other games that you speedran or that you tried to get into?
Actually, yeah, there were definitely some Flash games that I would speedrun. I didn't even realize I was speedrunning them, but there was something actually inspired from Kaizo games. There was a Cat Mario game that existed for a while, and it was just a lot of different sort of Kaizo style, like hidden blocks and traps and things like that. And just ran on Java in the browser, and in college, in between doing assignments, I would just try to finish the game without dying, and by doing that, I was naturally trying to finish it as quickly as I could. So, yeah. But I've been watching speedruns a lot longer than I've been doing them. So I started speedrunning Majora's Mask 3D in 2015, but I've been watching speedruns since way before even GDQ started on the old website Speed Demos Archive. Pre-YouTube, you had to send in a video file. They would host it on their servers. And yeah, I'd watch speedruns of games that I would be playing growing up and things like that, just marveling at how they were beating the game. It's not like normal gameplay at all.
Yeah.
It's a completely different way of thinking, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And you've oh, sorry. So you've also done some casting and coverage a little bit for Games Done Quick, GDQ.
But yeah, speaking of GDQ, the
too, right?
Pennants on the back are the two events that I went to recently: AGDQ 2018 and SGDQ 2018.
Nice.
And I was commentating for the any percent speedrun of Majora's Mask 3D at SGDQ. It was a lot of fun. It's a crazy event. It's grown so big now. It's kind of fun.
It's definitely crazy, again, just how much it has grown. One of my presentations I give is about speedrunning as well. And it really did, I think, took a lot of people, at least in the mainstream market, kind of, by surprise to see how it grew. One day, this was this underground thing. The next day, AGDQ hit. And now it's just become a very big part. And as you were saying there, Vincent, it is such a different way of examining these games. And there's definitely, I'm not sure, this may even be too big for our cast tonight, but kind of looking at what you can learn from speedrunning and applying that to game design is also a very fascinating topic.
Yeah. I think that's a really good jumping off place too, because I'm interested to get a little more of Vincent's perspective on this too. A lot of it is that analysis of the game. A huge section of your run isn't just your execution of the moves, but deciding your strategy, what exploits you're going to use, the path you're going to take through the game. And if you think about a game design as incentivizing players to take paths through the strategy or game, when you have a speed run, you have someone who's not playing the game under the normal circumstances. Every strategic decision is focused on how to get to the end as quickly as possible. And so when you have something like that, it's almost like a second game within the game. And so when you have people who are looking to break the game, that can open up really interesting avenues of design space, especially when you're trying to kind of find hidden depths of strategy for players to discover.
No, absolutely. That's exactly where I would start when it comes to speedrunning and game design, is that you really, because the game, part of what a video game does is it tries to immerse you in this world, and part of what speedrunning is really looking at it from a different angle and not seeing exactly what they want you to see, but sort of seeing how you can take these rules that they've given you and sort of bend them to your advantage instead. And I feel like that really relates in game design to especially the playtesting process, when you have a game where the rules aren't set yet and you really want people to look at it from that sort of different angle to see your rules and sort of plumb those depths, see where it goes and what they can do, and that's definitely something I've noticed with playtesting games, and just the way that playtesters think about your game reminds me a lot of how speedrunners think about their games. And to your point, Josh, a lot of the speedrunning happens before you ever turn the game on. You're just you're coming up with your route, and you're seeing what tricks are available, and a lot of the time in speedrunning, I've played Majora's Mask for thousands of hours, but a lot of my time has been spent just sort of examining the system that the developers sort of handed off to us, and seeing what the limits of that system are, and trying to see where I can gain an advantage over the barriers that they put up for me to have fun. That's why the barriers are there. It's kind of interesting. That's where it's different. With playtesting, you really want to break the game so that you can sort of fix it a lot of the time. But in speedrunning, when you're trying to break the game, it's because you're really trying to create your own fun. So it's sort of they're related, but a little bit different as far as the goals are concerned.
Yeah, and like we were saying, like when you're trying to break the game, you're really almost like looking behind the curtain. You're seeing the man behind the curtain, in a manner of speaking, in terms of how this game is applied. And one of the things that I've seen, like, that's become very common when we see like a lot of like classic game speedruns, especially like notorious games. I know AGDQ has, the bad games block. That's a very weird one to watch. Is that they'll often comment on that if you were playing this, sight unseen or for your first time, this game is, a POS. It's horrible. You're never going to figure it out. It's terrible. But but for the people who learn these games, as you said, like get into the details and see what's behind, it becomes a completely different experience. Shark in chat remembers when we tried to play Jaws on stream one night and just the horror of that game, and then I watched someone like speedrun it in like 4.5 minutes, and that was like how quick it took to beat that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the most fun experiences for me watching the Games Done Quick events, the Awful Games block, is when a game from my childhood shows up there. Like there was a Batman and Robin game that was built on the it was built on the SNES Mortal Kombat engine, and it was just the worst game of all time. And not only was the gameplay really awful, but also you couldn't tell what to do. Like none of the systems were explained to you in any way. And just watching the two, it was a co-op run, which was great because it's Batman and Robin, and watching them just have so much fun with this game that just utterly makes no sense, and was just a horrible decision to tie in with a movie that was coming out. It was really a delight to see. So it's we break the games, but we love them. We do in speedrunning.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic of when you have a co-op speedrun versus a solo speedrun versus when you're kind of speedrunning in competition or attempt to set PRs or break records, is kind of the incentive of like when you think about when you're designing a game as a designer, you know, a lot of the fun of a game like Zelda is exploration, right? You're going out and immersing yourself in the world, which is, I think, something you said earlier. And when you're speedrunning, your goal is very different, right? It's completion. And so if you're speedrunning against someone else, you've taken what is a game that's primarily about exploration and is solo and turned it into a competitive multiplayer game, where instead the exploration joy is now coming from the how can I find all the exploits, right? And so you're exploring the limits of the game's like mechanisms and systems more than you're exploring the world.
And like this is like one of the weirdest things about kind of the growth of speedrunning, because I'm sure for all those old people watching this right now, we remember kind of back in the late 80s, early 90s when stuff like I think it was a show called Starcade. There was, of course, the movie The Wizard. Like, there was this big focus on this idea of what would be considered competitive video game playing. And what they kind of envisioned, thank you, Gord, over that, what they kind of envisioned was essentially what speedrunning turned into. You know, how quickly can 1 to 3 people beat this game? Who has the fastest time? Who knows the best ways through it? Uh-oh. I think we lost John again. Uh-oh, John's gone mute.
No, I think he's
I'm back.
Distracted. Yeah.
Okay.
No, but that's absolutely right. It's as soon as as from a competitive standpoint, before there was a multiplayer game, there were high scores because there used to be a counter that would tell you what your score was, and if you had a higher score than someone else, then you were clearly better. And then after the arcade era sort of ended, and a little bit into the home console era, there were some scores for some games, but it started to become that wasn't recorded anymore. So then it became, and it sort of grew naturally in the late 80s, early 90s, like how quickly can you finish the game, and that becomes the new metric of skill. But the interesting thing about it is that it is competitive, absolutely, but it's also very cooperative, and which again reminds me of game design, because everybody's working together. When you find something in speedrunning, you might use it to set a new personal best or something like that, but you're also just so excited to tell everybody what you found and record it and document it, and it's actually a really collaborative process to break the game together. It's you versus more the game than it is all of you against each other.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that may be lost on a lot of people who casually look at speedrunning or don't follow that much. That the person who gets up on stage and speedruns, they most likely didn't figure it all out on their own. It's usually, as you said, a huge group process. Somebody may come up with the trick for, let's say, stage 2. Somebody else can figure out the glitch for, boss 3. And then all that gets put together to create the run itself.
Yeah, it is. If you think of like a speedrun as or a route of a speedrun as sort of a design, there's everybody's working together, and you're always standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before. So when I first started speedrunning Majora's Mask 3D, the world record was like an hour and 40-ish minutes, and now it's close to an hour and 20. And I've sort of seen that process of finding new things and sharing and arguing about routes of what's better, what's faster, and really been delightful to see it. And the greatest thing about it, to me, is that it never stops either. Even games that have been around forever, there's something new that gets found. Yeah. So a game that's been out for 20 years old, the original Majora's Mask, they just found a really big new discovery. They found a way to access the the debug menu, which the developers had left in the game, in case they needed to test something out. And it's been 20 years. It's just been sitting there all along, and they finally found a way to sort of get there, and it's just completely changed the way that speedrun is run.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of an exciting collaborative process. It's
Yeah, and that's one they found, if I'm not mistaken, they like decompiled the code, right? It wasn't just they, accidentally stumbled into it.
It was yeah. So it was based off of a trick that they knew how it worked in the game's code for a long time. They'd been using it for something else for a really long time. Without getting too deep into the weeds, you were basically incrementing a counter up one at a time. And someone came up with a radical idea of, what if we did it like thousands of times? Could we get to this part of the code that we know exists, the debug menu, if we did this, if we repeated the same process and incremented this counter up into the thousands? And sure enough, it worked. But then the race was on to find a way to do it that didn't require literally doing the same series of actions thousands of times for several hours of gameplay. And they did, but it's sometimes that happens in speedruns. You look at the actual code of the game itself, and you have a desired result, and you have a mechanism that you think can get there, and then you do some tests and it works. But frequently it's also just playing the game and trying to do two things at the same time, or very regular sort of bug testing, and you realize that you've unlocked something that can save lots and lots of time for everybody.
And as like talking about the idea of like breaking video games, that brings up, I think, a very interesting topic that I want to get both of your thoughts on, as well as the chat. Like, when we talk about speedrunning, there's I think two very broad categories, glitch versus glitchless runs. And both require a different understanding of the design, as well as a different way of playing it. And I just want to ask, like, for everyone watching, and for you guys as well, do you have a preference for the types of runs either you like to do or like to watch? So, glitch versus glitchless.
I mean, it's actually quite a controversial conversation in the speedrunning space, because it comes to this heart of this idea of what is a glitch. And it's a little bit it's a little bit messy. What is a bug? What is a feature? And there have been community arguments. There've been huge splits in certain communities over what is a glitch and what isn't. So when you talk about speedruns, the cleaner category, the 80% glitched category, its rules are pretty clean, because just anything goes. And so I like that, because it feels a little less arbitrary. But I do enjoy watching glitchless speedruns. I just don't love the name so much. I think if you called it something like bug limit, or just sort of acknowledged that, like, glitchless is you're doing, or if you just separated it, so you're just, instead of glitchless, like there's no glitches, you just call it glitchless, because that's really more of what you're doing. What gets allowed and what doesn't get allowed, it becomes so messy that really, but what it is at its heart, and what I really appreciate is it's about trying to find the fun again, because sometimes the 80% category, like I said, you do something that's kind of silly in order to beat the game faster, and you lose some of the fun that way. And so I do enjoy watching and performing some categories that put a different arbitrary restriction on your play.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, the what is and is not a glitch is, even a run in which most games, I think, are not glitching, the player is still in no way really playing a game. It's not like watching someone do a playthrough of the game in which they're doing it very quickly. They're still fundamentally ignoring large sections of the game.
Oh, absolutely. All the glitchless speedrunners will tell you the comments on their YouTube videos of their runs are like, you still cheated the game. Like, you have to do this in this order. You're cheating, which is always very amusing. But it's the gameplay goals of a speedrun versus just playing a game for enjoyment the way that it's intended are so different. Even a glitchless speedrun is still a speedrun.
And for you, John, which one do you prefer? Do you have a preference for when you watch?
So I only watch speedruns. I do not speedrun myself. I would say I think the runs I actually enjoy watching the most are like very odd restricted runs, like 2 players, 1 controller, or players playing one-handed, or pacifist runs where you're not allowed to kill any enemies, etc., etc. Like those kinds of arbitrary, maybe isn't quite the right word, but unusual restrictions, I think help bring out creativity in the kinds of runs, and I think they help lead to really ridiculous moments, and that's kind of what I like to see, especially for something like a Games Done Quick event where you have a commentator who can help explain what's going on in the run to someone like me who's maybe not as familiar with the details of the game.
Shark's been bugging me about trying to do like a blind run of a game, like when they do like the Punch Out games blindfolded, which is just crazy to me.
Oh yeah, blindfolded punch out is always entertaining. A few years back at GDQ, they did 2 games, 1 controller. Both the SNES version of Punch Out and the original NES version of Punch Out were being played at the same time on the same controller, and that was a really fascinating run. There's a lot of fun things you can do with Punch Out. That's quite a fun game in the speedrunning world. It's you play when you're speedrunning. You play the game so many times, you're like, I know this game like the back of my hand. I could easily do it blindfolded, and then you put the blindfold on, and you're like, I have no idea where I am right now. Someone help! I need to use my echolocation to find out.
Yeah, it's just interesting about how all these different categories have really come about, and what that means in terms of playing these games. Now, I guess taking this further more into design. Like, to a spear on a dark little controller. Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me do that one next. Taking this back to design, one thing I wanted to quickly touch on, as we've said before about this idea of breaking the game, I think you were saying this earlier, John, about kind of like the different kinds of fun there is when you're playing a game casually versus doing a speed run. That, as we said, like from a design standpoint, you're not. Most designers aren't thinking about their games in terms of speedrunning, with maybe the exception if you put like a speedrun timer or a speedrun mode. And for both of you, like, what do you think about this? And I think, Vincent, you said this as well, like people saying, oh, you cheated the game where you broke the game. Like, what do you think about the idea that is speedrunning a game considered, I guess, quote-unquote, fun? Like, is it like breaking the experience? Kind of like, I guess, like the person who spoils a movie, or who doesn't get scared like at horror. Kind of like bringing it down for everyone else.
I'm kind of in two mindsets of this, because I don't think I could play Majora's Mask 3D normally again. I don't think that. So in that sense, the game is kind of broken for me. I don't think I could force myself to play it like I played it the first time casually. Again, knowing what I know. But and going back to your point about like designing your game for speedrunning, you're starting to see this more and more. Speedrunning has become bigger. Designers will start thinking about the speedrun of their game, and maybe trying to. I've seen some recent development work where the developers are talking a lot with speedrunners about features they'd like to be left in the game and things like that. And it's an interesting it's an interesting idea, but what I think is so great about speedrunning is that it's at the end of it takes place at the end of the design process. So when you're designing a game, everything can change at any time. You really, I mean, you have your core ideas and you know what you're chasing after, but at the same time, you could take the core, you could take the gameplay and flip it on its head, and it would still be the same design project. But the great thing about speedrunning for me is that it's what we've been given at the end, and it doesn't have to change, and it didn't have to be designed to be speedrun. It's just you're taking we're taking we're taking the game box that you gave us at the end, and we've played it and we love it, and we want to play it forever. And so we're going to continue to find the fun in the game.
Yeah, and I think there's a really good concept that I like for talking about kind of play in general, which is the idea of the magic circle. And this is kind of like the shared set of rules that we've all bought into. And you see this when you see like little kids, playing like, doctor or cops and robbers, and you see it in video games of like what is acceptable behavior. So a lot of kind of solo single player video games, the concept that most players have bought into when they're buying the game is that they are there to experience the story and maybe progress their characters, and they're going to do that relatively linearly in the way that the developer has laid that story out for them. And I think in many ways, speedrunning is kind of breaking the magic circle or shifting its window a little outside of the original developer's intent to change the goals of the game. And so some developers are saying, that's fine, I'm gonna make my game the way I'm gonna make it. And then I think there's also a school of thought, which is, if I know that people are gonna play my game this way, can I amp up the fun or encourage people or use the fact that people are going to do this to bring them in? And so, one of the things that I know, I can't remember if we talked about it last time, it fascinate me as a board game designer are roguelikes. And I think roguelikes are a really interesting case for speedrunning because some of them have ends and some of them can potentially go on forever. And the modern indie community has really embraced them as a way to ship games faster because they're procedurally generated and you don't necessarily have to build as much content. And so I see a lot of developers in that space starting to look at, especially like, what does the streamed experience of my game look like? What does the speed run of my game look like? What do some, like, even specifically things like building in things like pacifist mode and that kind of stuff into the core of the experience, with the knowledge that people are going to stream the game, that people are going to speedrun the game. And because the core loop of that game is so simple, they can really hammer in on some of those points.
And we've seen many independent developers have like integrated Twitch or streaming functionality, and even allowing players to, or having the stream audience affect the game, like having that built into it, which is its own other like fascinating topic, as well as this idea of, I know if Shark is still watching this, we've been talking about having a talk on the idea of quote unquote stream friendly games, or designing games around the YouTube and streaming communities of today. And
Yep,
go ahead.
I mean, it leads to some really interesting areas of game design. There's that Survivor style show where it's like a game show. Your Twitch viewers are voting on who to support and who not to support, and it's changing what's happening in the game. And it is interesting, and I think it's smart of developer or designers to think about their audience always. As board game designers, I know John is always thinking about who's playing this game, and what do they find fun, and it's hard to sort of live inside someone else's head.
Yeah.
But I know they do their best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the other thing with speedrunning is playing the same game, especially a single player experience, over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And that's a behavior that is not necessarily common. So especially for an exploration or story driven game. And so that's another one that I see when we have our times. I am obsessed with time loops. They're like one of my favorite concepts in pop culture and media. And the idea that when you restart a narrative game, right, you're in a time loop, and part of the fun of a game is learning and mastering its systems. And when you go through that single player progression, if you're playing a game normally, as you go through the game, you're going to get better at it, right? Mm-hmm. And then speedrunning is kind of that almost taken to extreme. Now you're restarting the whole game and using an entire playthrough of the game to get better at the game. Mm-hmm. And I think roguelikes in many ways, because when you die, there's typically some sort of permadeath or reset. Part of the fun is coming from that learning experience, right? Okay, I did something wrong. Let me reset and do it again. And I think people are kind of embracing that model of learning through failure or learning through completion, and saying that completion is only step one on my kind of learning journey on the systems of this game. And that's very different from a purely exploration driven type experience.
And I think, as you said there, it's kind of moving that magic circle into kind of like it's a different perspective. Like for myself, earlier this year with Resident Evil 2, I beat the game, first run, and it took me like 10 hours. Very first, completely blind. And then I saw, there's a reward if you do it at the S Plus rating. So I watched some videos, I played through a few more times, and I finally got it down to, I think, a 2-hour run on that game to get the S Plus reward. And it's, again, like, at that point, I want to go back to something what Vincent said a few minutes ago. At that point, playing Resident Evil 2 was different than when I first played it. And not only was it a completely different experience, but, I purposely ignored a lot of the aspects of the game because I already knew it. Like, why should I be worried about a jump scare in this part of the place when I'm never going to go there again, because I know my run through. And as we were saying earlier, Vincent, I wanted to bring this up, that once you start thinking about a game that way, you can't really unring that bell. You can't go back to playing a game casually after you spent 500, 1,000 hours trying to become the best at it. And I wanted to bring John into this point. Like, as we've talked about before, when it comes to play testing and understanding the user experience, like, one of the reasons why this kind of stuff is considered very underrated for a lot of developers is the fact that most people don't think about games along those lines. We've said this many times over, that if you do it right, nobody will say anything at all. You mess up, you will never hear the end of it from the consumers and reviewers.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that is, going back to how long is that loop of, if you have a game that's 30 hours to complete your first play of the game, or that's what's expected. Even if players really enjoy it, the majority of people are never going to finish. But even the people who finish may never play it again. And so that's one thing when you're talking about some of these games that are designed for this repetition. They typically are going to have a shorter session length to finish that core content. Right, that games, Oscar's coming, most people consider games as one and done. If you want to design a game that's going to have that kind of replayable loop and learning experience, you have to condense that core session length. And so that's something on the board game side that's really interesting, because obviously there are very, very few board games that have as much content as a single player video game. Most board games that are, a typical kind of family strategy game is between 30 and 60 minutes. A quick party game might be 15 or 20. And almost no one is buying games that are played a single time. They're almost a lot of the goal is to kind of hook people and have them play multiple short sessions. So the games that are these long content-based games have had tremendous difficulty in figuring out what's the correct amount of content to put. How do we progress players from one game to the next? How do we keep players coming back for multiple sessions? Because that pattern of play is very common in a video game, but people generally buy a board game expecting to be able to play it over and over again, even if they don't, right? So people will play, and if they feel like the game can't be replayed, even if it can, will be upset. And so we see things like Charterstone is a game from Jamie Stegmaier that is what we call a legacy style game. The idea that each time you play, you make permanent changes, like ripping up cards or putting stickers on the board that are going to permanently affect the state of future plays. And so in that game, he was polling his audience. He has a very big community following, and he decided very early that he was going to make a lot of units of a reset pack that would allow this game that was intended as a one-time experience that you play over, I believe, 11 games, to be reset and played again and again, or played a new set of 11 games.
Okay.
And based off of what people claimed they wanted, he printed thousands and thousands and thousands of these reset packs. But the majority of people finished this experience and said, well, I don't want to replay this. And so he had to warehouse clearance some, I believe, and some had to be pulped, though don't quote me on that. That just they were sitting there completely unused because what people claimed they wanted out of the experience was very different than the actual play pattern that they observed after they bought and played the game.
Yeah, and that I think is its own topic in of itself. That idea of the customer's unique experience with a game. There's one of the things that we saw, and this is probably its own tangent right here, that we saw a lot of Telltale's games during their heyday with The Walking Dead, Wolf Among Us, etc., that they're built around, you can replay this game, get all these different choices, but I think the vast majority of people played through it once, because as you were saying there, John, like, they got their quote-unquote experience, and then, going back over that almost seems like kind of erasing what they just did.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how complex the reset pack was either. I mean, imagine for a legacy game, depending on how many stickers and things are involved, it might not have been that bad. It might have just been cards to add back in and things like that. But part of the idea of replaying like a Telltale style game is just going through everything you had to go through to get to that point at the end, and most players didn't really want to make it there, or to get back to change that one little choice in the middle.
And go ahead.
And I think some of it too is perception of what kind of framing expectations. If people, especially for Telltale, right? If people view the primary value of the game as the story and discovery of those moments in the story, or the jump scares in a horror game, that lowers their even if when they go to replay it, they would have a very different experience. They perceive as, I've experienced the story of this game, and now I've seen it all. I don't need to see it again. Whereas when you have something, let's say, for example, like a competitive multiplayer card game or a competitive shooter online, people might play that campaign mode or the solo mode for those games, and then the replay value is going to come in taking the skills and mastery that you've learned by playing that solo experience and applying them into testing your skills against other players, and then that can be a near infinite replayable game if you mastered that multiplayer competitive experience.
Yeah. And like that right there has been one of the major reasons why many developers have moved to multiplayer-based experiences for their games, and why there was that brief scare, I think it was late 2018, early 2019, that single-player games were dying. Because for the majority of people, as you said, that the story or the first-time experience is considered to be the only thing for that game. why should I replay this game that I just spent 30 hours on? I don't need to get better at it. The story's not going to change if I beat this game in 10 hours versus 30, or, an hour instead of 10. And, like, in a weird way, like, speedrunning has kind of, like, shown people that there is more, that you can do more with a game than just play it from beginning to end.
It really is. It's going back all the way to the beginning. It's just a different goal. It's a different experience completely. You're not playing the same game again, and you really can't ever go back to playing the same game again. Just like even in the board game space, I was going to say, like, legacy games did this crazy thing of saying when you open the box the second time, it's not going to be like the first time you open the box. But I would argue that that's already a little bit true. The second time you play Settlers of Catan, you're not going to place your settlement on like the sheep and stone spot, because you realize that that's not going to get you anywhere. And so every time you would replay a game, it's going to be different as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that intrigues me about games that have these kind of tight loops, is coming in the board game space, right? When that reset and learn pattern is really is how a lot of the progression gets done, especially when you have a shorter session length or even a longer session length game, an hour and a half strategy game. Part of the joy is you play it once, you're like, okay, well, the next time I play, I'm going to try a different strategy. And so the game that Vincent and I designed together that's coming out in November, Chrono Corsairs, is a game about time looping. And a big part of what I feel is part of the appeal, and maybe this is just me because I'm a game designer and I'm weird, is that because the game is a time loop, inside one session of the game, you're going to loop and reset and have that learning experience, 5-6 times during the course of the game. And so you don't need the game is very replayable and it's going to be very, very different each time you play, but you get some of the joy of, okay, I tried this strategy, now I'm going to try a different strategy and see how it works out for me. And you get to have that moment of picking your strategy multiple times, even during a single session of play.
Yeah. And I think John and I may be kindred spirits on this. I'm also like, I love like time manipulation, time loops, as like a device or as some kind of like gameplay related element to it. Obviously, I think a big name example would be something like Braid from John and Blow. But I gotta ask you guys, I'm going to throw a little game design pop quiz at you. Did either of you play a Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter for the PlayStation 2?
I did not.
No, I have actually never had a PlayStation, so I am sorely lacking on kind of all the PlayStation exclusive games.
I owned a PlayStation 2, but it had a huge library, so I never came across Breath of Fire.
The reason why I bring that up is that was one of the... Oh, man, that may be like one of the first games other than something like Chrono Trigger. Hello, Rat's Tail. One of the first games besides Chrono Trigger to explore the idea of a time loop. It was kind of like a quasi-roguelike, where every time like your character's stats or basic things would become persistent, and the whole game basically took place in its own little loop. That every time you die, time resets back to when you began, but your character will be regaining power. And I think El Gordo or Oscar and Chad and I were talking about this, that the team who did that went on to make Dead Rising. And Dead Rising was another game that explored this idea of, I think it was a 3-day time loop, that you could restart the game, but you'll be stronger and more powerful. And like taking this back to this idea of roguelikes as well, that the roguelike genre is just very fascinating in that regard. Because John was mentioning a few minutes ago regarding kind of tightening up that feedback loop or the gameplay loop. That a roguelike, and Shark as well, that a roguelike may have like 50 to 100 hours of content, but in a single loop of that game may only be 30 to 45 minutes at most, as people who watch us play The Binding of Isaac certainly can attest to.
Absolutely. Roguelikes really have that tight loop. I got stuck in an FTL loop for close to 80 hours. And it didn't feel like hardly any time had passed at all because um, there is something about that experience of starting over that is really appealing in some senses. So you see it a lot in the video games. Obviously, the whole genre of roguelikes embody that idea of starting over. But Breath of Fire, Dead Rising. I remember Dead Rising. I think I played Dead Rising 2. That sort of same idea as Majora's Mask, where you have just 3 days to get out of the zombie infested town. You have to do everything you need to do to get out, or do as much as you can. Um, uh, but in Majora's Mask, the loop is sort of delightfully tight, taking us back all the way back again to the idea of like, what if we extended the loop from 3 days to 7? Part of the sort of quote unquote failure state of a game that's based on a time loop is running out of time.
Yeah.
And so you the entire dungeon structure is designed around that 3-day time limitation. You get so far, you learn about what the dungeon has in store, and then you realize, oh, I'm out of time. I have to go back to the start. And then it takes you less time to get back there for one reason or another. You've gained some sort of item or just the knowledge of what to do to get back to that state, and so you get there faster the next time. But it's really it's fascinating in the sense of Majora's Mask, just how important running out of time is in that time loop. I think it's really something we tried to capture in Chrono Corsairs, where you only have a limited amount of time to do what you're doing on the island before you have to start over again. So that the way how you spend your time becomes very important, and you learn things as you go. It's
yeah, and that's the thing, is I think people see the restrictions, and this is I think true of almost any restriction you're going to give a player. And when they butt up against the restriction, they say, this is constraining me. I don't like it. But and Oscar's pointing this out in the comments too, a lot of games really only work because of those restrictions they put on you. The strategic decision, and I know people don't necessarily think of a game like Dead Rising or Majora's Mask as a strategy game, but if you imagine the strategy of how do I spend my time during that loop, right? That's a strategy of what am I going to learn? What am I going to uncover? And that decision of that I don't have an unlimited amount of time to explore, I have to pick how I'm going to spend my time, is really, really important in making these games challenging and interesting and making you want to come back to play again. Because if you had an infinite amount of time, what you think is, well, I would keep exploring and explore everything. But what you would do instead would actually, you'd explore some stuff and you go, I'm bored. Whereas when it forces you to stop, then you go, well, now I have to try something different next time.
Yeah. And to Oscar's point in chat about Dishonored 2 as well, like that's always another really big point, is that if you give the player all the options, it may either A, break the game, or B, overwhelm them. They may not have any idea, okay, if I can super jump, super fly, invisible, one-hit kill everything, is there even a point in playing this game anymore?
I got that way on Dishonored 1. When I could freeze time, have the extended blink, and the last level was just like, nobody saw me, nobody heard me, it's like I was never there. I'm like, this is kind of fascinating. And what was great about Dishonored was that the pacing of that was really good. The progression was well paced, so I was finally at the end game when I was sort of that powerful. But when that pacing isn't quite right, it can feel really like what is the point? Why am I even here?
Yeah. And that's the thing, is so you can definitely have too much of a good thing in terms of progressing players too far in terms of their advancement, or giving them too many options. And that isn't to say, and Oscar's putting great stuff in this chat right now. So he's just to summarize for people who aren't reading the chat live, there's an argument about having all the options available versus letting people freely experiment. And I think one of the things that we talked a lot about in the speedrunning discussion earlier is the idea of experimenting and breaking and pushing the limits of a system. And so in speedrunning, that those limits on options are how you get to experiment, because you're experimenting within those constraints. And so I think in many ways those constraints help breed creativity for people to experiment. And obviously, if you constrain it too tightly, you have a cutscene, right? It's press A to continue. So you gotta figure out, you can't narrow the players in too far, and you have to give them enough room to find their strategy and find their path. But if you give them unlimited room, they won't feel as much like they've earned anything or they've been creative. And maybe they'll find their own pattern and find their own goals, right? So I mean, and there are certainly games that are like that as well, like a Minecraft style of well, there is a goal that helps you win the game, but very few people play Minecraft to win. And so I think if you're going to design the kind of game that's just that open-ended, you really have to be aware that that's the kind of game you're making, and you can't make a game that has an end and then decide, oh, actually, I'm going to make it completely open-ended.
Yeah. And there's actually 2 points I want to go from there. The first one, I think this is a very important consideration, as we talk about with roguelikes and having their own kind of internal time loop to them. One thing that I think it's very important from a design standpoint is the difference between the player having to restart the game versus kind of the game forcing the player to restart. And what I mean by that, for people who don't normally play roguelikes, is that there are some roguelikes out there that have that kind of legacy or persistent element to them. And they're designed in a way that you literally can't beat the game on your first go. You simply don't have the stats, you don't have anything, and there's no way you're going to do that unless you're basically required to replay that game. Versus, say, a roguelike like the Bind of Isaac, where you have to restart from scratch, but every run has the capacity to go in wild directions. And this is one of the things that was very polarizing. I don't know if either of you played the game Rogue Legacy that came out a few years ago. That was one of the more controversial points about that design.
I did not play Rogue Legacy, but I did hear about that, and that is a really fascinating idea of sort of forcing the player to replay by making it just actually impossible for them to complete the game on the first loop, either by luck, because I know that there's a certain degree of luck to games like Binding of Isaac and FTL, where you can complete the game on your first loop, versus Rogue Legacy, where it was virtually impossible to finish the game in a single loop.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, and we talk about the player perception thing, people perceiving a game as being fair, right? Players want fairness even when they enjoy things that aren't fair. So as long as they perceive that the game is fair, then they won't complain. And so people see a game that is unwinnable as unfair, even if it's really even if the game could have just been so difficult that they were incredibly unlikely to win, and 95% of players wouldn't win on their first run anyway. The fact that it's that take from 95% to 100, I think rubs some people's sense of fairness the wrong way.
And of course, don't forget about RNG as well. And everyone's love that 95% chances can still miss.
Yep.
Now, as a quick time check, we are just around 8:30 my time. We've been going for about an hour. I know we set around a stop point for 9 o'clock. So, I guess, do either of you have any topics or any points you want to bring up about, time as a game mechanic, time, as part of the gameplay loop? If not, we'll move on to talking more about your game. But for the chat watching, if you have any questions for us, please feel free to leave them in the comments below.
Yeah, actually, just one more point
Mm-hmm.
off of John's point around fairness and time loops in games. A sort of controversial change that was made in the Majora's Mask remake
Mm-hmm.
was the implementation of a save feature. In the original game,
Mm-hmm.
you couldn't save and then quit and come back
Yeah.
later to pick it back up. You had to actually reset the loop every time in order to save. That was the saving feature. Is
Mm-hmm.
you'd reset the loop, and that would save your game state. But obviously, it would take away all the things that left when a loop reset. And so a lot of players felt that that was unfair. That
Mm-hmm.
they should be allowed to save the game and put it down and come back to it later in the state that they left it. And when they did the remake of the game, they implemented a saving feature. And in my opinion, it sort of like the consequences of that changed the game completely. All of a sudden, you didn't need to reset the loop as often, because if you didn't like how the latter half of your loop went, you could go back to that earlier state and do it again from that sort of point in time instead. And just sort of the consequences of giving players what they feel is fair, and how it really changes the entire design. Time, as we're trying to say in this whole show, has a huge impact on the design of a game if you let it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a lot of, I think, the psychology too of how safe are you, right? And there's been way more in-depth things written on me about us, that spacing of save points or checkpoints within a game, or or can you save at all? Is there permadeath? What progresses forward after you die,
Mm-hmm.
etc., is really interesting because it plays with your investment in your current game state. So the safer you are on, I'm 20 seconds of my progress will be reset if I die or if I fail, then that creates a very different mentality in terms of what I'm willing to risk.
Yep.
And when things are danger, how do I feel about the stakes, right? Am I invested in the fact that my character dying is bad if I can reset without penalty? And so that's where you have to figure out what's the kind of experience and what's the kind of emotion you want players to feel at specific moments during your game, and understand how to pace your saving or checkpointing, either system or where those are in your game's length, to drive those emotions. Because players are going to play a boss fight very differently if when they restart, they start right at the very beginning of that boss fight, than if they restart 5 minutes before it, right? Those are very different psychological things in terms of progress, when you as a designer are designing the kind of pacing of saving states within your game.
Yeah. And like that is like its own discussion right there. Especially like people who watch me know that when I play ARPGs, I play on hardcore difficulty because I find those games too boring. If I can just slam my guy, or just keep rushing into a fight, die, restart, and it just does it again and again and again. And it's just as you said, John, it's such a different feel and different weight on the player when they know that instead of losing 20 seconds of time, I could be losing 10 hours of building this character. Mm-hmm. But I know you guys do have to get going in a few minutes. And again, we could sit here and chat, 4 or 5 hours. John is well aware of how long these casts can go. So, with that, let's talk briefly about your upcoming game, and then we'll wrap things up there. So let me pull up some of the images that you sent me, and I'll switch the UI, or switch things over here. Alright, so I guess for both of you guys, what is Chrono Corsairs? There we go.
John, you want to take this away?
Yep. So Chrono Corsairs, which is coming out at the end of November from Tasty Minstrel Games, or TMG, is a strategy board game in which you are pirates who have crashed on a cursed island, and you're living the same day over and over again. And that is going to drive your exploration of the island and your competition with the other pirate crews for treasure. And so some of the types of treasure, like doubloons, you're going to have to spend, and they'll reset at the end of a loop. If you don't spend them, they're just gone. And then some of the types of treasure, what we're calling time gems, you're going to get to keep loop from loop. And as the game progresses, you're going to uncover more of the mysteries of the island, and you're going to understand a little bit more about your opponent's plans within a given day, and be able to react and change your own strategy within the game. So we took a lot of inspiration from kind of popular culture, time looping movies and TV, to look at what are the things that we wanted to show about the process of learning a loop over and over again, especially when it comes to competing with other players and understanding. I think a lot of time loop movies are kind of people versus environment. And so that dynamic is very different when you have competitors who are going through that loop with you.
And as you were saying earlier, John, regarding the fact that it's not just that you're looping like from one play of the game to the next, but you're actually having looping during the play of the game. What is the difference in terms of like how those two actions play out for the player?
Vincent, you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So at the end of each sort of turn, you'll reset all of your pieces back to the start, but on things that have happened on the island, these events, you'll know where they're going to happen at one time. So you can now use that to your advantage to sort of plan your next day. But we are really sort of emulating starting a game over again from scratch by moving all of your pieces back to the starting position. So just the same way that you don't play another strategy game the same way the second time you play it, when you start your second turn or your second day in Chrono Corsairs, you know a little bit more, so you're going to play out the day a little bit differently. You also, there's other forms of progression. You get to change your plans around, and you get to upgrade your crew with the doubloons, like John said. And so there's a it's sort of like starting the game over, but there is in-game progression that is still occurring. That's a little bit different from starting a game over from scratch, but we are really trying to sort of start the game over 6 times or so in a single game, to get that tight loop, like a roguelike.
Yeah. And I think one of the things too is Vincent talked a little bit about plans. So for me personally, there's kind of 2 elements of the restart. One is knowledge that I've gained by going through the loop, knowledge or skill, and then the other is kind of like character progression, right? The fact that we have a mechanical advantage when we started the loop now that we've upgraded. And so plans are both in our game. So a plan is a card that you play in kind of a timeline that shows what you're going to be doing during the day. So, for example, this plan might say, I'm going to move my officer into a beach. And when I play that card, that upgrades my ability to do something. So that has changed my capabilities within the loop. But it also, now that it's in my timeline, it's there until it's replaced or changed. And so I've now given my opponents information for future loops to say, hey, here, I know every day at noon, John is going to move an officer into the beach. And so as you're upgrading your own capabilities, your opponents are also learning your strategy and how you're going to take your path. And so I like that kind of double layer of every time you are upgrading your capabilities, you're also giving your opponents information that they're going to learn from for future loops.
It kind of reminds me of like that scene in Bill and Ted, like at the end when they're basically having like a little time fight. Like, I'm gonna go back in time and leave a anvil over here. Oh yeah, well I'm gonna go back in time and leave a trampoline right there, and so on and so
Yes.
on. I guess in terms of like how long does like a typical turn last? Because I know for a lot of board games, some of them like turns can take like minutes at a time. Some can just be a few seconds. Like, how long does like a general play of your game last?
Well, the game lasts about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, roughly, um, at
Yeah.
the higher player counts. And there's only uh, a limited number of turns per game, so each turn is only going to last, between 5 to 10 minutes, I suppose.
Okay.
Or wait, sorry. There's two concepts there. There's a turn and then there's a loop. So a loop is going to be 5 to 10 minutes, but a player's turn, I'm generally going to get to do 4 things within each loop. So I have 4 times during the day where I get to do something.
Okay.
And each of those turns is maybe 30 to 45 seconds. So I'm going to move my pirates here. I'm going to attempt to start a fight with one of your crew. And so each set of actions is nice and bite-sized for players. It's not like I do my whole day, then you do your whole day. But together they kind of create one whole event, and then we loop it.
Okay. And one thing that I wanted to bring up that we talked about earlier in the discussion on roguelike design and making sure the player knows that there's a reason or there's enough motivation to return to a game. How are you guys tackling that in terms of, I guess, replayability or just how much, I guess, variance is built into this game?
Quite a bit, actually. So the board, if you saw in the pictures, all of the sort of locations on the island are modular. So
Okay.
there's that outer ring, and they can all be rearranged, and there's an inner ring that can all be rearranged, and there's these secret caves, which all do something unique, and so those will change from game to game. So the island is going to change a lot in between each play of the game. Then there's the event tiles, which are randomly placed throughout the island, which all happen at different parts of a loop. So either they happen in the morning or in the at noon or at midnight. Those are all going to change from game to game. They'll be the same during that game that you play, and so you can use that knowledge to affect your future turns. But every full game loop, loops within loops here, every full game loop, those events will be in different places on the island and occurring at different times, and so there's a lot of I know you can sort of over exaggerate like how many different combinations there are, but there really are a lot of different things that come up in the game, and so it should be a very close to unique experience each time you play.
Yeah. And that's something that was important for us when we were going through the development process. Is we started actually with a fixed map that was the same every time you played. And if we think about some of the joy of the time loop is learning the environment and learning the island, that was something that we realized that was kind of missing psychologically as we went through the development process, and we added it in. So we started adding these modular systems. So we have anomalies that happen as the time loop starts going haywire. We have these event tiles that are different game to game, and we have the environment of the board itself is going to be different every time you play. And so kind of taken together, that's going to let you have a very different challenge, right? When you talk about learning and exploring inside of a system, we've set the initial conditions of that system, the kind of seed of the game, if you will, is very different play to play. And then each session where you're looping multiple times is going to let you explore the limits of that seed.
Okay. So essentially, the seed or the initial board is what gives it like the variance and the amount of options, and then within the loop itself, or within the actual play, as you said, you're able just to kind of test and play around with that individual or that single moment in time. And then, of course, when you start a brand new game, you get a brand new set of conditions, essentially you get a brand new toy box to play around with each time you play.
Absolutely.
And that, like, right there is like roguelike design 101 in terms of getting that feedback loop working.
Yeah,
Definitely.
So we're super excited about it. It's a very weird game, and so because we're weirdos, and so that's something we're just really excited to share with people and see what people say when they have this experience, because it's really very different from a lot of other similar strategy board games in the way that its loops kind of present itself.
Great. So I know you guys have to get going in the next few minutes, so we're going to wrap things up here. I just have a few quick questions just about the board, about the game itself, and then I will let you go. So the first one, when will it be available for people to buy?
The game is coming out on, I believe, November 20th of this year from Tasty Minstrel Games. The best way to get a copy is if you have a local board game store to go in and ask them to pre-order you a copy, and they'll get one right at release. Should be available in local game stores nationwide. As of now, they don't have any online pre-sales or similar, though that may change. And if you are attending the Board Game Geek convention in Texas in November, that will be the official launch and release of the game, and I will be there running some demos and saying hi. So if you want me to add some weird special loop stuff to your game, I'll write some in for you.
And what's like the number of players who can play at like one time?
Yeah, it's 2 to 5 players, and again, as Vincent mentioned, it's about 60 to 75 minutes.
Great. So I think with that, my final question for both of you is: do you have anything you want like end the cast on? Anything to say to the fans? Anything about time and games? The floor is yours.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much again for having me on. Really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. And I hope that if your viewers pick up the game, that they tell us where they find the fun in the system, in the box that we present to them, because it's really what this has been a lot about for me. So really excited to see what players think when they pick it up.
Yeah. Yeah, same. Thanks again for having us on the show. If you have any questions about anything that we covered in this topic, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Das Brieger, DASBRIEGER. And happy to kind of answer questions or chat time loops, send you all my favorite time looping movies, whatever it is that you want to know.
And for you, Vincent, what's your Twitter if people want to follow you there?
Pretty much everywhere. I'm at megahertz. It's MEGA_HIRTZ. It's on YouTube, Twitch, where I stream speedruns. On Twitter, that's where you'll find me.
Great. All right. Well, as always, John, you are always welcome back on the cast. Whenever you're free again, we can have you on for another discussion. And Vincent, once again, it was a pleasure hanging out with you tonight. And if you would like to come back on again, have design topic will travel kind of fits around here. We can talk about almost anything. But
yeah, definitely.
Again, guys, thank you for coming on. Best of luck with the game. We'll include links to it. There should be links in the description for those of you watching this recorded right now. But we do need to do a cast about speedrunning in general. That'll be very interesting.
I mean, I have a lot of opinions on the topic, so just let me know.
Definitely. But we're going to wrap things up for tonight. As always, for people watching us live or recorded, thank you for tuning in. If you're new, be sure to check out our Discord channel. It's open to everybody. There is a link to that in the description. You can follow me on Twitter at GWBicer. And if you are a developer or want to come on to talk design, please get in touch. We're always looking for new guests. But as a quick note for people watching live, our nightly stream will be slightly delayed as I go get a late dinner, but I'll be back on in a few minutes. But come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And until next time, take care.